Madam Chair.
Senator Daines.
Madam Chair, thank you. Deputy Chief French, the Forest Service determined the Middle Fork Judith Wilderness Study Area was unsuitable for wilderness over 30 years ago, and then again in the fall of 2021. Could you briefly talk about what led to this determination and what public input there was in that process?
Sure. Thank you for the question, Senator. The Helena Lewis and Clark National Forest currently went through a forest plan revision, and so they followed the processes that are outlined in our 2012 planning rule. So essentially what they do is they go through the entire national forest and they first inventory lands that have the potential to become wilderness, and then they evaluate those. And it goes through a very extensive public process to make that evaluation, both in areas that we'd recommend and both in areas that were currently part of the wilderness study area. Those then go through a set of alternatives for the forest plan revision, and then the decision that comes out of that, which again is probably, in this case, it was a 3 to 4 year process based on what we heard from the public and that extensive evaluation about if those lands are actually suitable is what we make our recommendations based off of.
Thank you. There's just been, I think, some misinformation back home from some who suggest there isn't a public process going through this, and obviously there is, as you just so well articulated. Some people have the misconception that by removing the wilderness study designation, we're removing all protections. Could you explain what protections will remain in place after this area is returned to general management?
The forest plan and their recommendations, in this case for removing of the wilderness study area, essentially would keep in place protections that are consistent with backcountry and roadless type management. So what that means specifically is that it's not suitable for commercial timber harvest. It's managed more for broad-scale, large-scale conservation and for primitive backcountry uses.
Yeah. I hope the folks back home who have been fighting on this hear that, because there's just a lot of really still strong protections in place once the WSA designation would be removed. Assistant Director Heinlein, the Bureau of Land Management reaffirmed that the Hoodoo Mountain Wilderness Study Area and the Wales Creek Wilderness Study Area did not meet the criteria for lands with wilderness characteristics just 3 years ago in their revision of the Missoula Resource Management Plan. But in your testimony, you say that the recommendation for release is over 30 years old. Can you describe the 5-year collaborative process that went into the revision of the Missoula Resource Management Plan and why you don't consider this process and the public input that was included to be a reaffirmation of the original recommendation?
Thank you for the question, Senator. In the 2021 Missoula RMP revision that you mentioned, it's explicitly stated in the RMP that, and I'll quote, that designating lands as wilderness or removing the wilderness study area designations is outside the BLM's authority and was beyond the scope of this revision. Therefore, the Resource Management Plan did not make any determinations as to whether any wilderness study areas was indeed unsuitable for wilderness. However, as you've noted when you talked about the Forest Service, WSA's, the RMP did, however, outline alternative management for wilderness study areas should they be released by Congress in the future.
And so, I mean, I realize the buck stops with Congress in terms ultimately of whether or not we release it or move into wilderness study, but the Forest Service makes recommendations on either suitable or not, but you're saying BLM doesn't?
The suitability determinations that were made in the 1992 and 1993 are the recommendations that stand today.
Okay, they still stand today then. Okay, thank you. Deputy Chief French and Assistant Director Heinlein, as wildfire season continues, how would returning these areas to general management might improve your ability to proactively manage them to mitigate the risk of catastrophic wildfires? We'll start with Mr. French.
Given the time here, I'll kind of land it in two places. It changes the approaches you use with suppression of fires using less, we call mist-type techniques. That can change if the fire is getting out of control, and it changes our ability for mechanical treatments. When it is wilderness, we primarily rely on prescribed fire as a way to reduce wildland fire risk in wilderness areas versus other areas where we have a broader set of tools available to us.
Mr. Heinlein?
Yeah, similar to what Mr. French described, we would apply the same suite of tools, the same minimum impact suppression techniques that were mentioned. I would also mention that in the case of these two wilderness study areas that are the topic of the BLM lands in this discussion, if Congress were to release them and they were to become backcountry conservation areas or areas of critical environmental concern, as the Missoula Resource Management Plan prescribes, the suppression tactics would be similar to as they are today. It would be the same standard.
Deputy Chief French, the last question. The roadless rule limits timber harvest and mining substantially, but does allow access to restoration work and habitat improvement work for threatened and endangered species. Can you discuss what this means for WSAs when they are returned to general management?
So if they are contained within areas that were covered administratively by our roadless rule, what the roadless rule does is prohibit commercial timber harvest, which means you can't rotate and manage the timber towards on a commercial basis. It does not prevent you from using mechanical means or timber harvest techniques to reduce wildland fuel loading, to create broader restoration needs. Let's say you're protecting a source watershed, or for thinning or something that is needed to protect a critical species. It just limits you from managing it as essentially a commercially based timber harvest stand.
Yeah, but thinning would be allowed there for what you talked about as a way to improve habitat.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.